This story comes from a book called Cold Case Christianity for Kids, which is written by a real-life police detective by the name of J. Warner Wallace. You can learn even more about how to think like a detective by going to his website, casemakersacademy.com. We've been talking about eyewitness testimony. So today I thought perhaps we should actually interview a real eyewitness. Daniel's mouth falls open as he looks up to see his sister, Lacey, walk through the door. "This is Daniel's sister," says Jeffries. "You'll recall that Lacey told Daniel she once saw our skateboard, so she's perhaps our best witness." "Thanks for having me," Lacey says. "I've been curious about this academy. It's all Daniel can talk about." Well, let's get started with the interview. Would you call yourself an expert witness on skateboarding? Lacey hesitates for a moment. Not really. I never actually owned a skateboard. My mum didn't think they were safe. Now, Lacey, why did you specifically remember this skateboard? The large blue poly wheels made the board ride really fast. Lacey points to the blue wheels. It's a smooth riding board too. How often did you see your friend Moses skating on this board? Lacey says, Moses was on it almost every day. All right, I just wanted to show what an interview is like. Any more questions, cadets? Nobody said anything. Okay then, thank you for dropping by, Lacey. You are free to go. You're not going to arrest me? Lacey smiles as she stands up. Everyone laughs and Lacey leaves the room. Cadets, I hope you were listening closely because today we're going to talk about hanging on every word, listening to what is said, how it is said, and also what is not said. Much of the time we don't listen very well, you know. Oh, you sound like my teacher, Hannah sighs. Everybody laughs. Your teacher sounds like a good detective, Hannah. Listening is the key. We're trying to collect as much evidence as we can from wherever we can find it. When someone answers a question, we need to listen for what they say, but also listen for how they say it. The words they use, the words they decide not to use, and the way they describe things. Remember, every speaker or writer has a choice when it comes to words. Their choices can tell us a lot about what happened. Words can even be evidence. In fact, I think you all may have received another clue or two about that mysterious skateboard if you were listening carefully. You and Daniel look at each other. He raises his eyebrows and you just shrug. What clue is Jeffries talking about? Daniel doesn't think it's odd that Lacey knew so much about skateboards when she never actually owned one, but he's not sure what he might have missed in her words. Well, we're also looking into the case for Jesus. And we have a great opportunity to listen very closely to the eyewitnesses. These witnesses have been dead a long time, but we do have their testimonies and we have them in great detail. Today let's take a look, for example, at the gospel of another disciple of Jesus's, Mark. Papias, that student of John I was telling you about last week, once said that Mark wrote the gospel based on the preaching of Peter. In other words, Mark's gospel is actually Peter's eyewitness statement. Jason speaks up. Well, why isn't it just called the Gospel of Peter then? Because Mark was Peter's scribe. A scribe is someone who writes down someone else's words. So he wrote down Peter's words. And so he's the actual writer. He's the author. Jeffries can tell that Jason isn't satisfied with this answer. Well, how can you be so sure Mark's gospel contains Peter's information? Asks Jason. Well, one way is to look at how Mark writes his gospel and the words he uses. Remember, words are evidence. Jeffries picks up his marker. Let's talk about some word evidence and make another circumstantial evidence diagram. Jeffries takes a Bible from his desk, flips a few pages, and then looks up. If you listen carefully to what Mark says the next time you read his book, you'll find some interesting things like this. Number one, the Gospel of Mark has a lot about Peter. Peter is a major character in the Gospel of Mark. Number two, Mark writes about Peter like he's his friend. Number three, Mark treats Peter very kindly He doesn't say embarrassing things about Peter, even though Peter did some embarrassing things. Number 4, Mark shares interesting little things that only Peter would know about. And these things are not in any of the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John. Number 5, the last one, Mark seems to know a lot about Peter's preaching, a lot of detail. Okay, let's have a look at number 1. Peter is a major character in Mark's Gospel. Even though the book of Mark is only about half the length of the book of Matthew, it mentions Peter by name almost the same number of times. That makes sense if Peter is the one telling Mark about Jesus, and if that's true, we would expect to read more about Peter in Mark's Gospel because it's Peter's words. Detective Jeffries draws a calculator on the whiteboard. This is just a symbol of Mark mentioning Peter more than anyone else. Alright, number 2, Mark writes about Peter as if he's a good friend. The other Gospels refer to Peter by his full name, Simon Peter, but Mark just calls him Peter. That makes sense too if Mark is Peter's special friend and scribe. Jeffries now draws the word Peter. Number 3, Mark treats Peter very kindly. Mark seldom says anything unkind about Peter or embarrassing about Peter, even when he makes a silly mistake. That may also be good evidence that Mark is writing down the words of someone he sees as a friend. He doesn't want to embarrass him. For example, Mark's the only book that doesn't talk about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, which is where Peter said, "No, don't wash my feet." I think Mark could have been protecting him there. Detective Jeffries draws a heart on the whiteboard to represent that Mark is looking after Peter as he writes. Number 4, Mark writes little things that only Peter would know. In many places in Mark's Gospel, there are small, little, unimportant details that only Peter would have known. This makes sense if Mark is listening carefully to Peter's story. Like Mark talks a lot more about Peter's house than Matthew, Luke, and John do. He draws an image of a magnifying glass as a symbol of the detail. Number 5, Mark seems to know a lot about Peter's preaching. Mark's Gospel is different than some of the other Gospels. He doesn't, for example, include the story of how Jesus was born. Mark's style is very brief. It's very similar to a sermon that Peter gave later in the book of Acts. And this may also be evidence of Mark's friendship with Peter. And so lastly, Detective Jeffries draws a picture of a microphone. And this one symbolises Mark knowing Peter's preaching. Calculator, it's a major character. Peter, he's a friend. Love heart, he's kind to Peter. Magnifying glass, lots of detail. And the microphone, Peter's preaching. So can you see that each of these 5 things all point towards Mark writing his Gospel just as Peter told him? Would you agree? When we start paying attention to Mark's choice of words, we discover things that we might have missed if we weren't paying close attention. Detective Jeffries turns to Jason. There are very good reasons to believe that Simon Peter, the fisherman who followed Jesus, shared his memories with a writer named Mark. And that means Mark's Gospel is important to us as we are trying to understand the truth about Jesus. Jason looks impressed. He wonders, though, if he might have missed something when Lacey gave her statement about the skateboard. Okay, use your time now to fill in your detective toolbox. This week we learnt a detective skill that has the initials WM. Any ideas? I'll give you a clue. The M stands for matter. What things matter that start with W? Yes, words matter. It's all about what people say, how they say it, and what they don't say. And that's a good skill not just for detectives, but for all of us. 2 more skills to go. You can also fill in another definition today. And the definition is forensic statement analysis, or FSA. Forensics is all about using science and scientific techniques to find out more about the crime or the crime scene. And forensic statement analysis is when we use science and careful listening and studying to look at the words that somebody says, a suspect or a witness, the words they've said or the words they've written. Why did they choose those words? Because sometimes you can even work out if someone's lying based on just the words they say and how they say them. So let's do that as we read the Bible. Let's study each word carefully and work out why that word was used. What was God trying to say to us through that person who wrote the Bible book? You can also download this week's activity sheet, which is a finder word. Have a go. If you've missed a chapter, just go back on the church YouTube channel and you'll find any chapter you need there. You're becoming better at thinking like a detective. See you again soon.